Good afternoon to our listeners. We want to welcome you back for another episode of Roose's Book Club. My name is Simrit Smith. I am one of the founders of the club.
And I'm Ryan Robinson, Parent-Chief, the founder and director of both Roose's Book Club and the Future Leaders Program, which is the organization behind Roose's Book Club. And we'd like to welcome you back to today's episode. This is Season 2, Episode 2 of Roose's Book Club.
And we're continuing from our last episode, Subconscious Limitations. We're reading the book Black Skin, White Mask by Fanon. And this book is a psychological study of the Black psyche in a white world.
So essentially what we're going to do today is we're picking up off of our conversation from episode 1, which was 2 weeks ago, on Frantz Fanon's book. And we're going to get a little bit deeper into some of the examples, tying them into the Bermuda context and set the stage for our next episode. So just to give a bit of a recap for our listeners on Roose's Book Club and where we are, the purpose of Roose's Book Club is an open community and curriculum for nation building and empowerment. It was created out of a desire by young Bermudians to obtain deeper knowledge of their history and critically discuss perspectives on issues facing our community in the context of the legacies of colonialism, underdevelopment, historical inequity, and injustice. And so in our last episode, we were exploring the book Black Skin, White Mask by Frantz Fanon, which explores the psychological impact of colonialism on Black people and the ways in which racism shapes their identity. So in that book, essentially, Frantz Fanon was a psychologist exploring the ways in which colonization creates a sense of inferiority in Black individuals, often being pressured to adopt the culture of the colonizer, essentially wearing a white mask in order to fit in. And so from a psychological perspective, Fanon argues that colonization creates a psychological dependency in the colonized to basically internalize this sense of inferiority, and that impacts our sense of self and the way that we relate and have relationships with others. So in our last episode, we looked at different examples that Fanon talks about in, for example, our relationships, Black male-female relations. We talked about it with language, the ways in which we Bermudians may either code switch or neutralize or water down the Bermudian accent in order to fit into certain spaces. We talked about how it affects the decisions we make in terms of employment, business versus the trades, for example. And overall, we just talked a little bit about the importance of recognizing that we all have some subconscious biases, some subconscious limitations, some things in the back of our minds that we may not even realize we have that have the effect of valuing Black people and Black Bermudians less. And the ways that this shows up in terms of the way that we lead, the way that we follow, the way that we engage and raise our children, the way that we educate, all having the effect of creating a sense of dependency, a sense of mistrust, a sense of a lack of self-confidence, and sometimes often a lack of confidence in others who appear to be confident as well, because our sense of dependency and our inferiority complex causes us to impose that on others who look like us, being Black Bermudians. So we started by talking about that in our last episode, particularly as it relates to this book by Frantz Fanon, and unpacking it from a psychological perspective. And in this episode, the aim is to go a bit deeper and try and tie it into some homegrown Bermuda examples of how we may be acting out this inferiority and dependency on each other and on ourselves.
And the purpose of us even having this conversation is the ethos of the book club. We're trying to have conversations around nation building, empowerment, community building. And this is such a key point to reiterate to audiences, to communicate to audiences, and to have these conversations, because we're not just here to have another talk. We're not just here to get on the radio and to spew our distaste or dislike for the things that's happening in our community. And we're going to say it again, we're not here to just hand out solutions like to the issues that we're facing because we feel that we have all the answers. That's not the intention. We're here to empower we're here to know better in order to be able to do better, because we feel that and we believe that we can have a better Bermuda. We delved into kind of like these three areas of the inferiority complex of not loving ourselves, the mistrust that we have in each other, and how that causes us to self-sabotage, like you said, Rai. To go deeper, Fanon points out that colonization disconnects us from our ancestral identity, and it was replaced with European ideologies. And the thing that was the most interesting to me, kind of had a light bulb moment, was part of why it causes us to have this inferiority complex, why we then have all this self-doubt and self-hate and second-guessing, is because as you look at colonial history, a lot of the ideologies were set in direct opposition to African identity. And that was a really interesting point, because you hear a lot of rhetoric about how being pro-Black isn't anti-white, but he put a different perspective on that rhetoric for me, because I had to kind of think like me being pro-Black does in a lot of ways, or pro-Blackness, not me necessarily, but when we talk about Black identity and trying to set up systems for ourselves, a lot of times we kind of question like, why does it get attacked? Why is it that it causes so much issues? And then it's really important for us to understand that when we do start to identify in areas that connect us more to our ancestral roots and things that are authentically us, it is going to cause some pushback, and it is going to cause discourse, because the systems that we're operating under were set up to be intentionally in opposition to who our ancestors were.
Right. I mean, it's a great example, right? Because it's not a matter of, being pro-Black is anti-white. It's actually the entire concept of the white system and the whiteness that was imposed upon Black people was in direct opposition to the Blackness and the Black systems which existed at the time. So it's not a matter of Black people living in authenticity, putting ourselves on the back foot as if we have to defend against, that whole, diametrically opposed system of Black versus white. It shouldn't even be relevant, because we're just talking about living authentically based on the systems that were in place and the cultural practices and the views that we had prior to being interrupted and directly opposed. So I think that's a great point to draw out, Simbrit, because when we look at episodes from the past season, where the focus was on foundations, we were looking to see how Black culture, Black identity, and our society was disrupted. And when you zoom out from the personal and you just look at it from a structural and a systems point of view, we realize that a lot of the foundations of society, of our Black societies, were completely dismantled. And you need to have that foundation there so that we then as individuals can function and operate authentically. And that's where we come into this season now, where having talked about the foundations required in the last season of Roose's Book Club, the focus of this season and this particular episode and the one before is around the individual psychology of Black people. How now, having accepted that these systems, these foundations, the environment in which we operate has been dismantled, destroyed, and interrupted, how has that now impacted I when I look in the mirror, and you when I look at you, whether it's around the community club table, whether it's in the boardroom, whether it's when I'm hiring you for a role or a job, whether I'm evaluating you in school? How does it affect our individual psychology in ways that we don't even realize? And that's exactly why we get into subconscious limitations, the title of today's episode, part 2, building off of Frantz Fanon's book that we introduced 2 weeks ago in the first episode of this season, because we're trying to tie in how, if we accept that these systems have been destroyed and that we're not living authentically as a people, then we must recognize the trauma and the psychological toll that it takes on us as individuals which is interrupting and affecting our day-to-day relations and relationships and engagements and decisions with each other as Black people within our current society.
And to zoom right back in to that personal level, it's important to me in particular to use the word shame when we talk about that internalized inferiority, because that's also like a piece that we don't really mention. We don't call it shame. We don't call it trauma a lot of times in an academic setting, but it's also really important to bring that piece back into it, because I think it removes a little bit of that every time we do. Like, that's part of the empowerment, to remove the shame of it, that it's something that we have to kind of prove and defend and to kind of like press over and over and over again, knowing that this is a systemic issue. It's not personal anymore. No, we don't have to be ashamed of who we are authentically, because this wasn't our doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's very important that we draw that out, because in this day and age, when we talk about racism, colonialism, we kind of look at it like it's this academic, theoretical exercise. You know, it's almost like we only talk about it for those who care about social justice or politics. You know, we look at it like we're removed from it personally. And I think what you're talking about, Simbrit, and particularly what Frantz Fanon is doing here, is he is bringing the human element, the personal element, back into the conversation. When we're talking about race and inequality and injustice and politics and independence, it's not just this theoretical discussion by academics that are thinking about some policy or some law or some program. We're actually unpacking here our own conscious and unconscious beliefs about ourselves, and the ways in which, like you said, trauma, shame, embarrassment have manifested through racism, through inequality, through the environment in which we're in. Because if we're going to talk about gang violence, we're going to talk about gun violence, we're going to talk about education and the economy, we can't just look at it like we're removed from it. We have to recognize the ways in which our own beliefs about ourselves have been shaped by that history and the systems that are in place today. And that's exactly what Frantz Fanon does in his book. He's looking at racism and colonialism from a personal, psychological perspective. He was a psychologist, and the purpose of his text was to bring a psychoanalytical perspective into the conversation, basically looking at how we associate Blackness with wrongness, the unconscious mental training, the cultural effects of that, what we're exposed to, the mental wounds that we have that are part of our behavioral makeup, and how it creates a collective nature among us as a colonized people that causes us to have some just deep-rooted and deep-seated mistrust and beliefs about each other, which interrupts community and the ability of us to function productively from a place of good faith with each other, because that's what really is speaking to is, in a summary, in a sentence, the ethos of Frantz Fanon's book is, because of the disruption of racism, colonialism, the erosion of our culture and our authenticity, we as individual Black people have deep-seated traumas that we may not recognize and biases that we may not be aware of that cause us to navigate the world with each other from a position of feeling inferior, treating each other as inferior, mistrusting each other, and essentially having a sense of dependency on white and Western society, whether we recognize it or whether we don't. And so we need to look in the mirror and analyze that and unpack the ways in which it plays out so that we can help to repair and heal ourselves so that we can again operate from a place of authenticity with each other as dignified, full, and complete autonomous individuals working together. And that is what makes a community.
And that's what we're going to get in today. We're going to look at how the pillars of society specifically in Bermuda, because we're going to bring this talk real personal today. We're going to bring it right here at home. We're going to look at how pillars of society have been impacted by all of us being messed up, by all of us kind of experiencing this trauma and this tragedy and this system together. And I want to start off with housing, because we definitely got into that last week, and we had a caller that called in to give his experience. And what I want to kind of say to our listeners is that today we do want to acknowledge the nuances. We do want to acknowledge that there are very real experiences that everyone is kind of having at the same time. What we're coming from and the angle that we're coming from is a little bit more of like a general view of things. And we want to balance. We want to balance the nuance and the personal day-to-day experiences that everyone may be feeling in their own lives, and putting it in the context of what it means for us as a collective in this system all together, how we feel about ourselves, our own conscious and unconscious beliefs, how we're then projecting that onto our people as a collective, right? So we talked about how our own sort of inferiority can also lead to the mistrust of others. And we talked about that in the housing, and like the conversation around housing, right? One thing, as I reflected on last episode, was how as a collective, we don't feel safe, or we feel safer with a foreigner in our space than we would a local. And even using the term local, we know what that means, right? Local, you're not always going to picture in your head a white Bermudian when somebody says local. You're going to picture a Black Bermudian, which even just adds to the unconscious sort of bias and unconscious thoughts and ideas that we have in our head as we have our lay conversations day to day, right?
Because the example that was given was when we talk about housing, locals, for example, being bad tenants or not treating the landlord's property with respect. And we know that when we talk about housing in Bermuda and the housing crisis, it is predominantly, and it's just a matter of fact, a crisis affecting Black Bermudians. And so when we hear the term about the difficulty of renting to locals, that is often associated with Black Bermudians. And unfortunately, as the caller who called in mentioned, you even have Black landlords that are having issues or are complaining of negative experiences with our own Black Bermudian brothers and sisters when it comes to housing. And so we're not going to get into the specific examples because obviously, in some cases, those are perfectly valid. But what we're speaking to, as Simra just mentioned, is the psychology behind the general attitudes that we may have towards our own people who are in many cases our family, our cousins, brothers, sisters, people that if you go back in the historical line, these are our people that we're having challenges with in terms of whether that's on the rental side or the landlord side. And how does that tie into what Franz Fanon is saying?
And the question that I ask myself is, what happens? Because like you said, right, all of these are valid concerns and these are real experiences that people have had. But what happens when the anxiety and fear overrides our discernment? So
what do you mean by overriding our discernment?
So, for example, you've had a bad experience with a tenant. It could be a single mother who had a teenage boy who then invited, because of the things that he may have been involved in, trouble then landed around your house. An incident might have occurred. You might have had to ask his family to leave, and now you are left with the wake and the consequences of having to clean up and to fix whatever it is that was broken, whether it's a tangible fix or an intangible fix, right? So now do we say to ourselves that you're never going to rent to another single mom with a teenager again? Do we then start making it difficult for all families, for all moms, single moms out there who are trying to raise their kids in in a stable environment, do we now make it more difficult for everyone that comes in afterwards? And that's what I mean by like, do we let the anxiety and the fear override discernment? There are definitely ways in which we as a community can help each other to be able to decide to make these decisions that are very personal in our lives, right? And what is it like, what type of community, what communities and what pillars do we have in place to then help counteract the negative experiences that we do have?
And then, with housing being a core necessity for a stable home and therefore a stable community, environment, family, how are we contributing as a people to creating an environment that increases a family's or decreases a family's ability to have stability? And how does that impact community violence, for example? I mean, a lot of the issues that a landlord will face, if you're housing a local Bermudian family, are just issues that we all face, right? And it is easier objectively to just rent it out to somebody from the international business community, an expat, a foreigner, who is going to pay stable because their company is paying it. And they don't have family here. So you don't have to worry about family drama, right? You don't have to worry about disruption. You know that the company has got that person covered. So you have that stability. So, we're not casting judgment on landlords or tenants in this case, right? We're just drawing out real examples. And obviously, logically, in that case, if you're preserving your own financial interests, it is the easier route. So we're not challenging that, right? But we're asking, what is the impact on the community? Because if I'm housing a local family, if they're staying in my place, let's say it's a 5-year duration, you're bound to have a couple of instances where somebody shows up or they have an issue or they may be a little late. These are normal community issues, right? And we cannot insulate ourselves from them completely if we have them as a tenant. So what's impacting the community is going to impact my tenant because they're a local, just like it's going to impact me as a local. So we're not attaching morality to it, but what we are trying to do is at least encourage the discussion and the questioning around, naturally, a landlord renting to a Bermudian may present more risks and challenges than a foreigner, in the same way that a lot of companies don't want to hire Bermudians because it is easier to get an expat. And it's not because an expat is better. And I think that's where we go wrong. It's not because an expat is better. An expat doesn't naturally make a better tenant. An expat doesn't naturally make a better employee. The difference is that if I'm going to a different country solely to work, and I'm either going by myself or I have family who are being paid to come as well and have their expenses covered, I'm naturally going to have less issues because certain aspects of my life are covered and that risk is removed. Either if my children are getting paid to go to school, if I have a housing or a car allowance, if my mother and father or my siblings who have health challenges are in another country halfway around the world, I don't have to stop work to go to a funeral. I don't have to, pick up my child or pick up somebody from school due to an emergency. It's just different things happen when you take somebody from a different environment and you bring them to your environment solely to work and pay bills. And the intention behind this aspect of the conversation is to say, yes, Bermudian landlord, yes, Bermudian tenant, we may have issues with each other because these are issues that normal people in any community are going to face. The challenge is, are we perpetuating cycles and creating these scenarios because of our own beliefs about each other, which are just being exacerbated by economic conditions, social pressures, which we are fueling in a repeated cycle.
And the breakdown of self-determination comes from the perspective of, if a community is constantly forced to fight for its humanity, it's going to be harder to unify for long-term progress. And instead of focusing on building institutions of wealth, energy is spent fighting oppression just to survive. So everyone's just in this perpetual cycle of survival. You don't build from that.
So many of our people are focused right now just on finding stable housing and paying bills that we're not in a position to think. We're not in a position to build. We're not in a position to contribute positively to the community because we're in survival mode, as you mentioned. And we'll come back to this later, but this ties in very deeply. It seems like a very simple, specific example, but it ties in so much to the national agenda for progress, because for those of you who have been listening to season 1, where we talked about the foundations of society, you will know from Chancellor Williams that you have to have the basics taken care of before you can talk about building community, before you can talk about justice, equality. It's just basic, modern times we call it Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You got to have food, shelter, water, these basics. But that also extends on a societal level. If our young people, if our mothers, if our families have a struggle day to day in just having a roof over their heads, there's no way that you're going to get active participation at the local PTA meeting. There's no way you're going to get people questioning their politicians effectively because they're reading the news. There's no way you're going to get people taking their parents out of the hospital and not blocking beds because they have nowhere to go. So we have to tie in our views about each other and that mistrust that unfortunately has deteriorated and the national systems, the national structures, the social issues that we face as a community. They're so deeply linked, and we have to get to the root of them if we're going to make progress. So that's just one example in the housing. There are so many others, and we're going to try and cover more of them today while we still get to the point of why this is important based on Frantz Fanon's analysis.
And this is where definitely like the community violence really shines through for me when we're talking about this, because that self-hate, that mistrust of each other, it's gonna manifest itself in violence. And we have to stop calling it senseless. Like, it has sense, it has cause, it has effect. We know both on an academic level and from lived experiences that when you have a society that's unstable, when you have a sector of the population in which they're just in survival mode and fighting for their basic needs, people are going to then resort to immoral ways to get it. And people are going to disregard, sense of self, respect for others. All of that's going to go out the window.
Can I give an example? So for those of you who know me, you know that, the Roose's Book Club is part of Future Leaders Bermuda, which runs the Future Leaders program, right? So every summer we have an educational, intense experience with at least 15 to 20 young people where we, over the course of 3 weeks, unpack some of the social issues, they explore themselves. It's a transformational experience for young people between 13 to 18 years of age, right? A few years ago, we started to notice, because we do this every year, that the attendance and involvement of parents in their child's educational experience got worse and worse in terms of engagement. And when you see children come into class or come into the program late, no involvement by parents, no response to emails from parents, no attendance, it's very easy, to say, these parents, they just don't care. Like this generation's parents are just terrible, like they don't have any involvement in the children. They just drop them off. They just want to be babysat. And I had to check my bias, because when we had our closing ceremony one year, there was a young man, and he had nobody there at his closing ceremony. He had to give a presentation after this 3-week experience, and nobody showed up, right? This was maybe 3-4 years ago. So I went in the grocery store the other day, and there was a mother behind the register, and I didn't know that was the mother of the child. I just ended up having a casual conversation. I was with my cousin. We had just cracked a joke to the cashier, and they said, "Oh, what's your name? You look familiar." And we struck up a conversation, and we found out through that conversation that this mother was the parent of that child who didn't have anybody there. And I didn't mention that. I just casually asked how the child was doing. And the parent said, I'm so excited. The child's coming home from school. They're studying X, and, I'm going to spend some time with them. And I remembered you from Future Leaders, they said to me. And they said, this holiday coming up is going to be the first time in 20 years that I've had the holiday off because of this new job I've gotten. And it just really made me think about that times a classroom full of students, like how if we have families out there that are single mothers raising kids on their own, don't have that family support of the 8 and 9 siblings like what generations of the 60s had to sit and care, and grandma and all the rest at a family homestead. If you just have one parent that is trying to work, pay bills, pay rent, have a decent child with a decent education, how does that trickle down in the ways that they show up for the next generation? How does that young man get proper development to avoid a life of crime, to avoid selling weed, to avoid hanging out after school with so-and-so because their house is small and they're ashamed of their living condition, or mama's never home, daddy's not in the picture. So this stuff matters, when we talk about whether that's housing, whether that's community violence, because we're now living in this, post-2000, I would say. The generations growing up now many of them do not have family homestead with mama, daddy, auntie, uncle, brother, sister, siblings, all in a cycle with each other working as a collective household unit. It's just one parent or one or two parents all working all the time, multiple jobs. Child has to figure things out.
The best phrase I can think of, or the phrase that comes to mind as you're talking, Rye, is we're all alone in this together. Where we've seen such a breakdown in Bermudian society, in our communities, that our families are doing things on their own. We're under such enormous economic pressure. It's forcing more and more parental figures into work, into overworking. Where does that leave our kids? And how has that manifested itself in the community violence that we're seeing? Because as the last couple of months has shown us, we're no longer dealing with adults who are committing these acts. These are our babies. These are children. Kids who would be technically committing truancy if they were in a stable environment. And after the break, we'll continue our conversation about how education also plays a role in that, and how, again, this is all just one big conversation about all of these macro pillars in our society are influencing and affecting each other.
So with that being said, we are on season 2, episode 2 of Roose's Book Club. The book that we are using as a basis for today's discussion is Black Skin, White Masks by Fanon. We are checking our biases, our subconscious limitations, and the ways in which the mistrust and self-sabotage as a product of racism and colonialism are manifesting in our community today. Roose's Book Club is presented to you by Future Leaders Bermuda, registered charity number 1009. The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect the views of our organization or any of us in our professional capacities. However, the content of all discussions is rooted in carefully curated learning material, and in that sense, not everything expressed is merely an opinion, but a reflection of our research and the aims and objectives of our organization as a whole. In all our activities at Future Leaders, we encourage independent thought with a community-centered and social justice-minded approach that enables listeners to gain a better understanding of themselves, disrupt the status quo, and take charge over their futures. We ask you to listen with this in mind.
Welcome back. You are tuned in to Roose's Book Club, and we are on season 2, episode 2, Subconscious Limitations. We are discussing Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Mask, and how our unconscious and our biases and all the things that we have experienced in this colonial setting and in these systems have influenced the way we see ourselves, influenced the way that we interact with each other, and how that can lead to self-sabotage and a breakdown in our community. Before the break, we were talking about how these manifest in macro pillars of our community. So we discussed housing, we discussed community violence, and we're going to continue the conversation with education, with the way we govern our systems that we have in place, cultural identity and just how all of these things deeply impact our ability to continue to build our community. And so, Ryan, one of the things that I have experienced, even on my professional level, is education, the breakdown in education. And we always have the conversation about, how public school children are perceived, public versus private. And that's a conversation that we don't want to kind of really dive into, because that's a topic that we talk about them as on a daily basis in our in our lay lives. But a trend that I am starting to be more and more aware of is how the student-teacher relationship, even within the public school setting itself, is going through this breakdown. And a lot of it has to do with the way children are now having to, in a way, like raise themselves. We talked about right before the break, we talked about how parent engagement has decreased over the years and the why. But now we're seeing how teachers, the relationship between teachers and students is being affected. And we don't really tie in the, like I said, unconscious bias, these limitations that we're holding and we're having within ourselves for our own people because of this colonial system that we have. And a lot of times, educators are writing students off before they even come into a classroom.
Well, and I think if we talk about the why behind it, right? It's not writing students off because they're unworthy or because, they don't believe the students are capable. I think when you're talking about that write-off, what you're saying is the system and students and teachers are all, and even supporting services are so overwhelmed that we're now in a situation where we're having to do a triage and sort of pick and choose which ones we're going to at least try and focus on to save. And, when you talk about that private-public school dynamic, I think we attach certain cliches and rehearse certain phrases, right? So in defense of public schools, one of the things we often hear is, well, keep in mind, public schools have to take everybody. And that's a very true statement. But unfortunately, we don't seem to analyze what that means, right? Like we'll say, hey, public schools have to take everybody. What does that mean? When we say that, what we're talking about is when you're in a private school setting or when a parent or family makes a decision to take their child out of public school, it's not just about the education. It's about this perception that they're removing the child from a certain environment so that they can focus more on the education piece. Because what we're talking about a lot of times when we say public schools have to take everybody is, because we're talking about children, right? But what I think what we're talking about is teachers now are not primarily focused on education. They have to focus on managing the entire child's development. And that means if a child is having trouble at home, if a child is raising themselves, if a child's parents or if a child has gone through trauma, what we're finding is teachers have to manage all of that so that they can then focus on education if they can. So when we talk about public schools taking everybody, the extended sentence for that is public schools are fully immersed in the community, and therefore the education of a student in a public school setting means that you cannot separate the education of that child from the community in which that child is living and the environment in which the entire system operates.
Exactly. And when we critique the system, when we critique the way in which our schools are governed, it really comes with that point of our schools are not equipped to handle that in the way that is going to be conducive and it's going to optimize the environment for both students and teachers. When students are coming in, because you have to take them, right? But when students are coming in with not just, when students are coming in with all of it, when they're coming in with their whole selves, because they themselves also have to deal with the fact that a parent is not involved or a parent is overworked, any complex trauma that they have, issues that they're facing within the school environment. We know that bringing in the topic of community violence and how that's finding its way into schools and the whole dynamic of that, right? How are our schools equipped to take care of that? And with it being all left to teachers, but then they in turn have their own policy. They have curriculums. They have deadlines. They have their own agendas that they have to be able to adhere to. How can they? How can they balance all of this together when they don't have the resources, when they don't even have the support that they need from a governance standpoint? Where does that leave us as a community?
There's another element to this, and I'm going to call it the death spiral. So schools and public schools are supposed to be part of a piece of a puzzle, which is what you're referring to, right? A school was never designed to completely raise a child, to feed a child, to house a child, to deal with a child's trauma, and to educate the child and to raise a child, right? Schools are supposed to be, their part is educating the child in a safe environment. Parents' part is making sure child does homework, making sure child at least knows their ABCs and, basics, right? So it fits into a puzzle. The challenge we're having now is when the school is forced to take all of it. The death spiral comes in where what you now have is Black Bermudians, everyday Bermudians, moving their children out of that public school system. And in an attempt to shield their own individual child from some of these issues, putting them in a different setting, what it's contributing to, unfortunately, is everybody that can get out gets out. And the balance within a school is interrupted, because if in a classroom of 10, you have 2 children who are well off, 2 or 3 children who are average, 2 or 3 children who need a little bit of extra help, you're going to get some sort of a mix out of that, right? Where, okay, maybe one parent's a bit more involved than this child's parent, but the PTA committee is functioning. You have one child's parent is holding that teacher accountable so that the other children are benefiting from, residually benefiting from that other parent who's very involved. One child is academically advanced, and so they can help that other child. It's the balance of a classroom, right? What we have now is anybody and everybody who can moving the child out of the system. You have to question who's being left. What now are our public schools dealing with? So you're dealing with more proportions of your classroom, a higher proportion having additional support needs, additional challenges at home, right? The quote unquote advanced students or wealthy parents or whatever, they're moved out of the system and going private. And so what you have left is you have a school full of trauma, full of children needing additional support, full of parents who are working extra, right? So the entire system is almost like having an insurance plan where everybody's got, extended health issues, right? Or having a hospital where everybody is in emergency and nobody's got time to focus on continuing care or whatever, right? Because that's what I call the death spiral, in the sense that the pressure is all on whoever is left.
And this connects to governance, right? Because when you have a sector of a community that then removes themselves from a situation in which they're kind of trying to save themselves, save their own. That disconnect, when those people then ascend into leadership, and now you're in charge of making policy. Now you're in charge of making decisions when you're in charge.
Too much.
No, we have to kind of go there, right? Because this is Bermuda. This is real life, what we're experiencing right now in real time. This is the lived experience of everyone that's in this crab bucket together, right? This is that disconnect. And we're going to tie in Dr. Hodgins' criticism of leaders who believe that assimilation was necessary to be able to sway votes, to not ruffle feathers at the worst, right? To be able to then push themselves into these spaces by disconnecting and breaking away from all the trouble, from the annoyance, right, of community, of the parts of community that we don't like, that we don't want to see, that are nasty, that are messy to deal with. We disconnect ourselves from that to put ourselves in a better position, rise up into leadership, and then think that we're going to be able to draw this connection by staying away. It's not going to work. The breakdown of self-determination is that energy is spent chasing acceptance into these colonial white systems instead of building independence, instead of being able to address the real issues that affect Bermudians that are really in spaces where they cannot get out of a death spiral.
I didn't preview that, Simbrit. No, honestly, I didn't even make the connection in the way you just made it. And that's deep because it gets personal. That's when we talk about Franz Fanon and the psychology, that gets personal. Even I, just listening to you, I felt that. I don't even have kids. But it's personal because, and this is where we have to come back to our rules of engagement with Roose's book club, right? Mm-hmm. Because what you just said is true, but it's not meant as an attack. No. It's not a moral judgment, right? We understand that there are parents and families out there that are doing what they got to do for their child. You have children with disabilities. You have children with additional needs. You have children with parents who just have the money to avoid those issues and that annoyance. And what you just described, that annoyance is not going to supersede my child and their growth and education, right? So it's a totally logical and rational decision what many parents make in order to educate their children. So I want to stress that this is not a moral judgment. It's not an attack. What it is an observation of how it fits into the bigger picture, because the impact is still the impact, even if parent, you got to do what you got to do. But the purpose of this and Franz Fanon's book is to look at how that contributes to our subconscious beliefs about each other and the community. Because if we do operate in an environment where public, communal education, whether it's education, health, whatever it is, put any social theme, any ministry behind that, if we're operating in an environment where the collective is perceived as being so bad, so annoying, so in need of help, that we need to withdraw for our own self-preservation, then that's going to have an impact on the way that we view those that stay. It's going to have an impact on how we view those that have no choice. It's going to impact our decisions when we're in a position to influence that system, because a lot of us become jaded, or we have to focus on ourselves, or we're going to put ourselves first, or we're going to mistrust the collective, those that remain. We're going to question those who stay that could go. And we do that all the time. People that could be in a completely self-serving environment or advanced in a social mobility perspective, but choose to help, choose to stay, choose to sacrifice. We sometimes question them. I'm thinking of even when you look at the Dr. Karika Weldon situation, when you look at Bermudian experts, when you look at Bermudians that come back and try and help, the way that we mistrust, we challenge, we even wonder, why would they want to do that? Why would they want to help them, And it causes us to mistrust even those that are trying to make a difference. So, we're coming to time, but I think that's a very important point you made, because it touches on some of the other things we wanted to cover around, when you talk about government, when you talk about boards, community clubs, community organizations, when you talk about Black-run institutions, businesses that require collective involvement and democracy, all of these biases, all these perceptions of each other and doubts are playing out in various organizations, which we see in the news and some not in the news. And we have to challenge our own projections and perceptions. Cultural identity. We've never been able to identify what it means to be a Bermudian. We use these loose terms like local and Bermudian and
even melting pot.
We've never defined it, right? And so what does it mean when the nationalities and groups we list off don't authentically mix as a collective? If we're fractured over what it means to be Bermudian, over what local is, if we're in an environment, even if you talk about education with public and private, it's very rare when you look around the world, the amount of children we have in private versus public schools, almost 50-50. And a lot of this has to do with our cultural identity, our ethnic groups, how we identify, class, race, all of these things. And without proper definition around that, it's hard to organize around common goals and have collective power. Did you want to speak to health really quickly, and then we can try and tie in the relevance of today's conversation with the bigger picture and the objectives of Roose's book club?
So first of all, I feel like we need a whole nother episode just to get through all of the information. But the word that came to me as we're reading through Black Skin, White Mask as we have this conversation is trauma, right? Like this is bigger than just even what's happening in Bermuda today. From season 1 until now, we have all experienced centuries of collective trauma. And Fanon points out that liberation starts in the mind, but healing from that trauma, that's incredibly difficult. And shameless plug here, like May is Mental Health Awareness Month, right? And me and you have had this discussion even recently about how the effect of trauma is definitely something that is missing from the academic space of when we talk about the impacts of colonialism, of racism, of all of these systemic issues, right? Because trauma is personal. It's so layered. It involves all these other combination of things that have happened to us individually. And to be able to face that, first of all, it does take resources. A lot of times resources that we don't have. A lot of times resources that we don't trust. And I definitely want to acknowledge that. But if the breakdown effect that it has on self-determination is that if healing doesn't take place, then that trauma cycle, it's just going to continue. It's going to continue. It's going to be harder for our communities to be able to heal, to organize, to trust each other, to envision a life beyond this oppressive state that we're in. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of our people is that emotional apathy because everyone is tired. Mm-hmm. Everyone is tired. But the thing is that knowing these barriers, understanding what they are, being able to call them by name, being able to have a discussion like me and you are having in this forum and in the way that we're doing it, mixing in the academic with the lived experience, right? That's the first step in being able to kind of like move forward.
So why does this matter when we talk about the psychology, when we talk about these issues, when we talk about Frantz Fanon's book? Why does it matter? We're going to connect you back to season 1 because we mentioned, for those of you who have been following along, that Roose's Book Club is a journey. It's a curriculum of books and learning points that are meant to build on each other. So as we wrap up for today, if we briefly go back and recall the last season, Foundations was the title of the last season, and all of the episodes within it were under the theme Foundations. And this theme for this season and this series of episodes being perception and reality. If we look back to season 1, Foundations, one of the key texts was Chancellor Williams' Destruction of Black Civilization. And on page 54 of Chancellor Williams' book, when we were exploring the foundations for society and the foundations for even this book club, we talk a little bit about the conditions that must exist for a people or a collective to think, invent, discover, and build. And so Chancellor Williams, as he's examining the destruction of Black civilization, outlines what are the conditions that must exist for progress for a people. And just as a recap of what those conditions are, point 1 was people must, in the context of Africa and development at the time, he talked about the people had to first become famine-free, able to settle down, and they're roaming from place to place in search of food and water. So he's basically talking about you need the basics, right? Food, shelter, water. The second thing was suitable territory so that the leaders could then negotiate with other neighboring societies and fragmented groups to begin the nation building process. So when talking about preconditions for progress, we got 1, you need your food, shelter, water, basic needs. 2, you need to have a permanent place. 3 is a crucial precondition is that there must be developed a sense of national community among the various groups that make up the country. This is so important that it cannot be left to wishful thinking or chance. It has to be programmed in a way that there's a sense of loyalty and a sense for the population of being an important part of a great united brother sisterhood. That is what makes up the nation, so that it can then develop naturally and allow the other conditions of progress, 4 and 5. 4 was a strong army for self-defense, and 5 was the rule of law and justice to promote equality for all within the society. So overall, what we're speaking to with Frantz Fanon's book is really point 3. You need to have an ability of the people to feel secure as individuals so that in their country, they feel a sense of community with each other so that they can build as a nation. So Chancellor Williams wraps it up by saying that people must feel absolutely secure as individuals so that in their own country there's equal justice. And these are some of the conditions that can bring about the internal peace, stability, and confidence which unshackle their mind so that there is now time to think. So we're talking about going from that stage of survival mode to development and growth. And in this book, for today's episode, Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, his psychological analysis speaks heavily to that point because the mentality of individuals and Bermudians within our society will heavily affect our ability to nation build across fragmented groups, identities. It's going to affect our ability to build a national sense of community and promote that brotherhood, sisterhood. So if we in ourselves are affected by all this trauma, all these subconscious biases, confidence issues, limitations, and self-sabotage, it's going to impact our ability to build together. And I think that's the relevance of why Foundations Season 1 connects to today's episode, Subconscious Limitations, and the overall theme of this particular part of this series around perception and reality. So I'm going to leave it to you to wrap up and introduce the next book so that we can prepare our listeners for the next episode in the next 2 weeks.
So with all that said, what Fanon shows us is that racism, colonialism, it's not just the external, right? It's deeply psychological, it's deeply emotional, personal, it's systemic. And again, understanding these barriers is the first step towards dismantling them, which is why we covered the topics that we did and we tied all of it together. We talked about the brain now. So now we want to talk about community. Let's talk about those steps, the blueprint to real self-determination, to real community building. And we're going to do that with our next book. It is called Black Power, The Politics of Liberation by Kwame Ture and Charles V. Hamilton. So we will see you guys in another 2 weeks. Thank you so much for tuning into Roose's Book Club.
For those of you that need to get more information or want to follow the series, follow the books, the website is www.roosesbookclub.bm. You can also go to futureleaders.bm and click on Roose's Book Club, and it's going to give you all the information you need to catch up on today's episode, past episodes, and prepare for the upcoming episodes over the next few weeks. So thank you for listening to today's episode of Roose's Book Club, and we'll see you again in a few weeks.